I keep hearing what I can only describe as the sound of a car dry heaving. So if you happen to hear any of that, I apologize. There's nothing I can do. Hello everyone and welcome to my November reading wrap-up. I'm sorry, I had a stroke. Against all odds, I read 8 months. Another stroke! Against all odds, I read 8 books in the month of November. I have to go to class in an hour, so we're gonna jump right into things. Starting with The Good Son by You-Jeong. I read this on November 2nd. This is a translated thriller following 26-year-old You-Jeong, who one day wakes up and he's covered in his mother's blood. This character has had memory issues as the side effect of this seizure medication he's been taking for most of his life, so he's not really sure what happened the night before, isn't really sure if he had anything to do with it, and we just kind of follow him around after that. Now, I'm going to parrot what a lot of other reviewers have said about this book. This book is not a whodunit, this book is a whydunit. Although when most reviewers are saying that, they're saying that like, this is brilliant, it is a whydunit, not a whodunit. Meanwhile, I'm like, yeah, sure it's a whydunit, but the why is stupid. I don't often like to start videos with a spoiler, but I'm gonna go ahead and do that for this particular book. For the non-spoiler review, I found this book to be blatantly unimaginative and obvious. I didn't find that I cared a whole lot about the main character, which may have just been an issue with translation, I don't know, but just in general, would not recommend 2 stars. For the spoiler part of the review, the guy's just a psychopath. That's literally the why. The why is just that he likes to kill people. There you go. That's the book. And very early on it talks about how much he loves watching other people suffer. And you know that there's something off with this guy the entire time you're reading. So for me, I didn't really feel like I got a whole lot out of this book. I've read psychopath characters before. This one just didn't do anything different. And overall, I just felt a little bit let down by this book. Moving on to the next book, we have The Madman's Daughter by Megan Shepherd. I finished this one on November 7th. This book is from YA of old, came out back in like 2013, and I never picked it up, but it is very much a product of its time, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So it's following 16-year-old Juliet, who has been disgraced by her father, who committed this big scandal years ago, and she's just kind of been living in poverty, just barely scraping by over the last couple of years. But then she gets word that her father is still alive and he's living on this secluded island, so she goes out to see him and very quickly realizes that he has been up to something quite sinister while on this island. The book is based off of the island of Dr. Moreau, so you can kind of guess what those sinister things are, but I will give credit to Megan Shepherd for not just this book, but with her other books in this series. She does do a really good job of reworking classics and not just repeating them. Like, she's taking elements from the classics that her books are inspired on, but you don't need to have read the classics, and also if you have read the classics, it's not going to hurt your enjoyment of them either. So that's something I felt like was really well done across both books, because I did in fact read the second book in this series, which you'll hear about later. Here's the thing, I definitely can get very nitpicky with books sometimes, and I've done it a lot on this channel. Like, if I see things in a book that I think are badly done, I can often go ham on those things. But I have to say, I'm not as picky as I seem, because with this book, there's a lot of like objectively not great things that I was completely willing to overlook. Why? Because this book was fun. The rougher elements of this book are mainly to do with the incessant repetition. There's a lot of internal dialogues that just seem to go on, and you will have to suffer through a teenage girl having incredibly poorly timed romantic fantasies about the 2 different boys that are madly in love with her. Like I said, this book is a product of its time, and a love triangle is right at the center of the story. And without spoilers, I personally believed she 100% picked the inferior of the 2. Now, the people that have read this book are probably like, wait, you're saying he was inferior? Yes, I am saying he was inferior. I 100% am. The other one was better. I don't care about the ending. The other one was better. I'll talk more about this with the next book. So now that I have mentioned the bad things that absolutely would have dropped the rating down quite low if I had not been having such a good time, let's look at some of the reasons why this was so fun. It has an excellent twist at the end. Like, this is not a twist I'm willing to spoil, even though I doubt anybody is going to take this recommendation, because if you didn't read it back in 2013, you probably aren't going to want to read it now. But yeah, the twist was chef's kiss. I found the book to be very exciting. It got so bizarre. I set the book down quite a lot just to be like, what is happening? And I am a firm believer in the fact that YA is good because it lets itself be over the top. Where I'm at in life now, I definitely gravitate more towards adult fiction, but the reason why YA fiction always pulls me back is it lets itself go there. It's not afraid to get a little campy, get a little silly, just be insane. So yes, I did in fact get the sequel from the library, and I did in fact read it this month. This was a very fun 4-star read. Next up we have Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora and Neale Hurston. This book I had to read for class. My policy is usually that I do not rate books that I'm reading for class because I doubt that I would pick this book up just on my own accord. It is about a woman named Janie who's kind of on this quest for fulfillment after her grandmother forces her into a marriage when she's still a teenager. And even without a rating, I will say I was pleasantly surprised by this book. It was clearly very ahead of its time, and I appreciated a lot of things about it. So that is Their Eyes Were Watching God. I finished this on November 7th. Same day I finished The Madman's Daughter, actually. Two very different books with two very different tones. Next up, I reached for a middle grade book. That book would be The Girl in the Well Is Me by Karen Rivers. I finished this on November 14th, gave myself a little week-long reading break. This follows Cami Summers, who's a middle schooler, yeah, she was in middle school, who has recently been moved to Texas because there are some kind of not so great things going on in her family. And while she's kind of being initiated into this like popular girls group, she ends up falling down an abandoned well. And the book basically takes just like a stream of consciousness route from there. Fair warning, this book gets really weird, but at the same time I actually liked it a lot more than I thought I would. The writing was both like visceral but also uniquely endearing, and I thought it was really impressive that Karen Rivers was able to pull that off. And even just a couple pages in, I was really enjoying just learning about Cami. She was a really well-presented protagonist. Some of kind of the weird factors that do come into this story, I felt like at times were a little over the top, and it kind of lowered my enjoyment of the story because I felt like I was just kind of reading to finish at that point. I also was not a fan of the ending, like full body cringed at the ending, but like that's okay. But I ended on 3 stars for this one. I honestly feel like it deserves a higher average rating than it does, even though I obviously did not help the average rating out by giving it a 3. Just in general, I think I just disagreed with a lot of what people were saying about it. Like for instance, saying that it was boring. I never felt that way about this book, but of course everybody is different, so I'm not going to judge what other people felt about this book. Next up, we have Bone White by Ronald Malfi. Now, I finished this on November 22nd, so it took me over a week to read, but I honestly felt like it took me 6 months. Basically following a man named Paul Gallo, whose twin brother went missing from this tiny little town in Alaska called Dread's Hand. The story opens with this longtime resident of the town confessing to about 8 different murders. And of course, when Paul hears about this, he assumes that his brother might be one of those murder victims, and he decides to head out to Alaska to investigate. I know that it sounds pretty good, and honestly, I don't think that it's necessarily bad, but for me personally, least favorite of the month. And the biggest reason for this would 100% be the writing style. I just did not click with it at all. You can hear me complain a lot about this book in my last reading vlog, but basically I just felt like it was kind of amateur and overwritten, which made it so that I never felt like I was actually in the story. I was just constantly fixated on how much I didn't like the writing. And this book was just kind of a bit of a wake-up call to me. Like, if you start a book and you're hating the writing for the first 50 pages, nothing is going to change by page 100, 150, 160. Why did I decide to go up in increments of 10? I don't know. The point is, I will not change my mind because the writing style is probably not going to change. And if that's the biggest thing holding me back, I need to put the book down. I gave this book 3 stars. I don't think it's an awful book. It just did not work for me. Sorry, we are in the middle of a windstorm too. I think that the car has stopped coughing up blood, but like the wind is also a factor, and I apologize for that. So if this book sounded interesting to you, I would recommend doing a little taste test. Read about 50 pages. If you don't like it then, you're not gonna like it later. I was not the only one that didn't like the writing style, but I also was not in like the majority. Most people didn't really seem to take any issue with it, so I honestly think with this book I was just being weirdly sensitive to writing style when I read it, but I did not enjoy the experience of reading this book, so that's gonna be a 2-star for me. Next up we have Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This book won the Women's Choice Awards. Women's Choice? Is that? No, just the Women's Prize. That. You know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, that's fine. It won a big award. I finished this book on November 24th while waiting for the ferry to take me home for Thanksgiving. It was a very, very long ferry wait. Oh, and I also have the book. I should like show it to you. Let me put its little dust jacket on. Now this book was required reading technically, but I had been planning on reading this book before I even signed up for the class. And when the syllabus came out and it said we would need to get Piranesi for the class, I was like, perfect, I was already going to read that book. So I am gonna rate this one just because it doesn't fully fall into like the required reading realm, in which it's like I just feel like I'm being forced to read it. I mean, that's a little bit dramatic. I am in college, so I am very much choosing to be there in terms of spending money. This book is about a man in a very, very big house with lots and lots of statues. That's all I'm going to say. I think you should go in blind. This is a book in which you are not going to understand what's happening for a good chunk of it, but it's okay because it is gorgeously written. It's really evocative. It's the type of book that will make you remember it. Like, I was chatting with my roommate's cousin, which I know this is a very random inclusion of a person in this reading wrap-up, but I was chatting with her and she mentioned that she had finished this book and she's like, I have been thinking about that book for months and I can already see that I am likely going to be doing the same. I highly, highly recommend this one. It's probably, I think, the best book that I read this month. I gave it 4 stars and not 5, and this is where kind of the dicey land of like objective versus subjective comes in, because objectively 5 stars. But for me personally, I wanted more from the ending. I say that it ends feeling just a little bit unfinished, but I wouldn't say that in like an objective sense. Like, I'm not saying like this book is bad or this is a bad thing that the book did. It really was more just like, wait, I wanted to hear about that. Why didn't you tell me? So highly, highly recommend this one. I'm so glad that I read it. Next up, we have The Wedding Night by Harriet Walker. I finished this on November 27th. This one I read on the way back home from Thanksgiving on the ferry. I spent a lot of time on the ferry this month. Now you're probably looking at the title and being like, is this a smut fiction book? No. It's about a wedding that gets canceled very abruptly. The bride doesn't really give any reasons for canceling, but all of her friends and just like the whole bridal party, they basically are like, hey, it's a destination wedding, we can't get a refund, we may as well just turn this into like a fun hangout. If nothing else, just so you can get your mind off the yucky circumstances, even though we don't really know what those circumstances are yet. So they decide to go on this vacation, and like, I want to throw in kind of like that thriller hook where I'm like, and sinister things happen or creepy things start to happen, but I feel like that honestly is doing this book a disservice because it doesn't really give thriller, and that's okay. It's just that I think this book was difficult to market, and that's why its rating is pretty low, is because people are expecting a thriller and not really, but it's not bad. And it really just does not have enough thrill to give thriller. Anyway, let's jump into some of the specifics. I hate to say it, but the writing is just not it. I think that I'm generally pretty open to authors sprinkling in fancy words every once in a while, but this book made me genuinely laugh at the amount of times the author was reaching for the thesaurus. Like, there were so many sentences that I had to read multiple times, and I had my phone with me for most of the reading experience, and there were a lot of words where I was like, I should probably look that up and like learn something new, which like, I do like doing that every once in a while in a book. It's like I see a word and I'm like, oh, let's look that up, learn something new, I feel great, everything is good. But after enough time, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm not going to do it every single paragraph. So in terms of writing, not off to a great start. The plot also gets pretty unclear for, I'd say, a good chunk of the book, because like I said, thriller, not really the right genre classification. So I do think that that was a challenge for the writer while constructing the plot. The messages that are presented in this book start to feel played out by about the halfway point, and then we just keep on hammering it home. And yet, I kept reading. This was a book that I got from the library thinking, like, if there's something I don't like in this book, I can put it aside, no skin off my nose. I didn't have it on my TBR. I don't feel like I need to read this. So I really had absolutely zero obligation, but I just kept reading. I can't even say why I kept reading. I had other books with me, but this book just had that quality, and I'll give it credit for that. And I was very happy with the twist that comes in with this book. Now listen, do not pick up this book and be like, ooh, I heard there was a good twist, because the reason why I think the twist worked for me is because I didn't even expect there to be a twist, because I had kind of buried all of my hopes for like a twisty-turny story long ago. So I think if you expect a twist, you're gonna be let down, but like, I thought the twist was really well done. So I'm giving this book 3 stars, because once again, you can get away with a lot if you give me an entertaining read. And I definitely think that this one fit the bill. My hands are getting tired because I'm weak, so I'm just gonna show you this and then I will put up a picture. But the last book that I read this month was Her Dark Curiosity by Megan Shepherd. This was in fact the sequel to The Madman's Daughter. I just finished this last night on November 30th, and I don't read a lot of series, so this is kind of a new revelation for me, but series are really hard to rate because inevitably your feelings are just going to be stronger one way or the other. If you're disappointed, it'll feel like a 1-star book. If you had like a mildly good time because you're already attached to the characters, it makes it a 5-star read. There's just a lot of emotional highs and lows with series that you just don't really get with a standalone book. So in rating this book, I definitely had to kind of like smooth over some of my like intense feelings that honestly had no right to be as intense as they were. I was really enjoying this book for the first chunk. As I said before, Megan Shepherd is really good at adapting classic stories. The first book was The Island of Dr. Moreau. This book was Jekyll and Hyde. Both times it is the same cast of characters. So I was having a great time, but then, and this is a major spoiler, so I will put the little spoiler tag up and tell you when you can go to where it'll be safe if you want to read this book. But basically, the two sides of the love interests, they're Montgomery and they're Edward. Edward's the better one, in my professional opinion. I just saw absolutely nothing in Montgomery. Not a darn thing. And for the first chunk of the book, we think Montgomery is dead because we had a little death scare at the end of the last book, which was less of a death scare and more of like a, yep, that's a corpse. But Montgomery was alive the whole time, and he shows up again. Like, it didn't really surprise me because I thought he was gonna show up, but like, man, I really wish that he didn't because he annoyed me so much. And I have to say, I didn't really read a whole lot of books with love triangles when they were really big. I definitely read a couple, but like the main one that everybody would know would be The Hunger Games, which honestly doesn't fit a lot of the parameters for most love triangles because there's just a little bit more going on because Gil represents one thing, Peter represents the other, da-da-da-da-da. But I feel like with a classic 2013 love triangle, no one's really representing anything. You just like one more than the other. So I ended up kind of tapping into some of my like love triangle rage, which I never really did tap into as like a teenager because I just wasn't reading that many love triangles. So for me, it was kind of fun to get that experience. But yeah, I hated Montgomery. What's my reasoning for hating him? Because he wasn't Edward. I hated him even more too because once he showed up, Edward's character got completely sidelined, which honestly I would rank that as being an objectively not good thing about this book. I think that switch around was really poorly done. Although I will say there were a lot of moments with Edward that were very cringy because like a whole thing with Edward is that he's like half Edward and half like this beast thing, and like the beast is like slowly taking over, of course representing Jekyll and Hyde, and whenever the beast had dominion, things got pretty cringy pretty quickly. So like I completely understand the author's decision to sideline Edward a little bit. It just made me mad because I hated Montgomery. Now getting out of like the subjective-y spoiler land that I was in, just in general, this book didn't give me the same twists and turns as the other one. It definitely tried. It's just the way that this one was set up, it just didn't lend itself to shock value as much as the other one did. And like I had a really good time with the shock value last time, so I wasn't as into it this time around. We also had a lot of the same repetition as before, and this time I was just even more annoyed with it because we already had that in the first book. Like the main character's whole thing is that she's worried about becoming her father, which like I get it, but it starts to read very Gabby Hanna very quickly. And it also just starts to feel like it's there just to pad the word count. Both of these books were over 400 pages long. And for what? I don't know. For the first book, could kind of understand it a little bit more. For the second book, absolutely not. I don't know why in the world the publishers were like, this has to be 420 pages for both books. Like, what were y'all doing? These books could have easily been like 370 pages long and they would have been so much better. Being fair to this book, I'm giving it 3 stars. Based on my highly personal feelings of rage towards certain choices that were made, I'm ending very disappointed with this book and I will not be continuing with the series. But basically this is a fun YA series. There's a love triangle. If you want to step back in time or maybe have that moment if you didn't have that moment when you were a teenager, I think that this is a good series to do that with. So that wraps up today's wrap up. I just started filming a vlog which you should end up seeing around mid-December, and on that note, thank you so much for watching and I will see you again soon with another video.